Hello to my Year 7 rock stars. We're going to move on to learning about weathering today. Weathering is a geographical process and it is the breaking down of rocks. So these two pictures show that very clearly. Where this stone or rock had been sculpted into a statue in the before picture, you can see in the after picture that that rock has been broken down. So we're going to learn 4 ways that this can happen to rocks. The 4 types of weathering that we're learning about are freeze-thaw weathering. This happens in cold environments or on the tops of mountains. Biological weathering, which is to do with plants and animals. Chemical weathering, which is to do with chemical reactions. And onion skin weathering, which is not to do with onions, but to do with rocks that have layers just like onions. Okay, freeze-thaw weathering. This happens when water might seep into a crack, like in this picture here. That water will then freeze when the temperature drops. So, for example, overnight, or if you're in an extremely cold environment. When water freezes, it expands by 10%. So the water inside the crack will fill the crack, but then that crack might expand by 10% because that water inside is frozen. During the day, that water might then melt and the crack will kind of come back to its original shape. So at the night it might freeze, expand by 10%, and in the day it will come back to the middle. And over time, this process will keep happening. And what happens to the outside of this crack is it weakens that part of the rock because it's constantly being moved, opening and closing, expanding and retracting. And so over time, this action weakens the rock and it will eventually split into these jagged pieces. Here you can see an example of where that's happened in over lots of parts of this rock. Onion skin weathering. Here's an example of what it looks like. And this happens when rocks are repeatedly heated and then cooled. So similar to freeze-thaw, but this time rocks that are in a very warm environment. As the sun shines on the rock during the day, the rock itself will expand because things that are heated expand. However, then at night, the rock will shrink because it's a cooler temperature. So it's just like in freeze-thaw where the crack was opening and closing, this time the whole rock itself is expanding and retracting, expanding and contracting. And the outer layers of this rock will become weaker in the same way that the crack did in the freeze-thaw weathering because of this constant expansion and contraction. So over time, this causes small pieces of the rock to flake off the outside like the layers of an onion, hence the name. So ogres have layers, rocks have layers, and they break off when they are heated up. Now, biological, you might have seen some examples of this, or you might start to notice examples of this as you walk around Leeds, because this is when plants might start growing within a rock and then basically crack open that rock and weather it away, break it down. So biological weathering is due to the action of plants or animals, in fact. It might be that a seed has fallen into a crack of a rock. This gives it shelter and moisture and it actually starts to grow there. It could also be if a small animal starts to burrow into an area and try and settle a home there. Over time, they might widen that rock's crack and break it down. Here we'll look at some plants. As the roots of that plant where that seed has settled inside a crack start to grow out, the roots will break down that rock and widen the cracks. And as the tree grows or the plant grows, it will also break that rock apart. Here's some examples. This tree here literally started to grow right in the middle of that rock, and you can see it's cracked it straight open. And here, really interesting, you can see where nature has started to take over some temples. This photograph was taken in Cambodia in Southeast Asia, and the trees are breaking down those temples because they're growing over the top of these ancient temples. Our last example is chemical weathering. this is what it might look like. So chemical weathering causes changes to the makeup of the rock, and this is due to a reaction. So it literally changes what that rock becomes because of chemicals. And rainwater contains small amounts of acid. You might hear it be called acid rain. And when acid rain hits rocks, it will start a chemical reaction. So some types of rock, such as chalk and limestone, will respond much more dramatically than other rocks. It can cause them to slowly dissolve and start to crumble away. Water and heat make chemical reactions happen more quickly. So chemical weathering is more common in places that are warm and wet. This is common in the Yorkshire Dales, and a really good example of this is also in Malham. In geography, we often go to visit Malham on field trips when you're in year 10 or year 11, and we can see this excellent limestone pavement, that we call it, that's been eroded by chemical weathering. So remember, weathering is basically the breakdown of rocks when a rock doesn't move. We've learned of 4 different types: biological, chemical, freeze-thaw, and onion skin. Go to joinmyquiz.com or click the link on the school website and have a go at the quiz. Well done, guys.